Pelosi and the progressives. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the conversation. I'm David Schuster. This has been an interesting time for Democrats, including House Speaker Nancy Pelosi. She has been able to get some legislation through the US House of Representatives, but she still faces some significant challenges from the left flank of the Democratic Party, including her own reelection. And joining us on this day is Shahid Buttar. He is running as a progressive challenger to Nancy Pelosi in the Democratic primary. And Shahid, good of you to join us today. Thanks for being on. Why the challenge to Nancy Pelosi, first of all?
I see the Democratic Party being led by a figure who has long supported Republican priorities, from relentless runaway military spending, as we saw pass the House just last night, to repeated tax cuts for the wealthy of the sort that were included in the Build Back Better bill. Every signature Republican priority over the last generation has been one ultimately shared by the leader among House Democrats. And for a city this progressive to be represented by someone as decidedly moderate, and I dare say even conservative as Pelosi when evaluated on the basis of her policy record, I'm very eager for our city to have more sincere representation committed and aligned with our city's proud values.
You hear from a lot of more centrist Democrats or conservative Democrats, if you want to call them that. Well, look. In addition to the stuff that may help benefit, centrists and Republicans, progressives also stand to benefit when Build Back Better actually gets through. Is there anything wrong with that argument?
Well, there's parts of the Build Back Better agenda that absolutely resonate with progressive concerns. For instance, the recognition of human infrastructure and the childcare provisions, for instance, those are long-standing progressive priorities that centrists have long impeded. As we look at the Build Back Better bill, the thing that sticks out to me like a sore thumb is the fact that the second largest line item in the entire agenda is a tax break for 13% of tax filers. And it's not even just the top 13%, it's the top 13% in high tax states, which basically reduces to Nancy Pelosi and her wealthy friends and donors. And that is an example not only of a prioritization of a conservative policy goal, but I dare say it represents unapologetic corruption. And it's disturbing that it has not been the object of more focused media attention, but the idea that we are spending 5 times as much on tax breaks for the wealthy than we are for childcare reveals what that package is ultimately about. The devils are in the details, and the details here matter, and they haven't been nearly enough the focus of conversation.
In addition to calling it corruption, you've also called it a conflict of interest for Speaker Pelosi. What can be done or what should be done in an ideal situation? I mean, it doesn't seem like she's really said, hey, I embrace these personally. It just seems to be that, well, this is how the legislation ended up.
Well, she did take a particular role in shoehorning it into the Build Back Better bill. It was a relatively late insertion. And the precise locus of the corruption is precisely the fact that her personal interests have not been disclosed. It's not merely the case that the repeal of the SALT cap, this is the state and local tax deduction, there was a cap on it previously, and the Build Back Better bill lifted that cap. And it's not merely the case that lifting that cap disproportionately benefits wealthy tax filers in blue states in particular. Nancy Pelosi is the 7th wealthiest member of a Congress of millionaires. She herself is poised to personally profit from the repeal of the SALT cap in the same way, for instance, that her family pocketed funds that were dedicated to the Paycheck Protection Program, in the same way that she has benefited from other tax cuts for the wealthy. The very first thing that has to be done here, I think, is for the press to observe the personal financial interests of wealthy career and even dynasty politicians and report on those conflicts. We can't rely on dynasty politicians to necessarily mind their conflicts. It's one reason why we have a First Amendment and a freedom of the press. To see the press declining to leverage it, to shine a light on instances of obvious corruption at scale, is a crisis for democracy that stretches, I think, beyond the Democratic Party, and it ultimately implicates press ethics as well.
Shahid, what has it been like running against Nancy Pelosi? I mean, she's obviously a very popular Democrat in many quarters. San Francisco would seem to be perhaps more hospitable towards a progressive challenge, but what has your experience been like?
I have faced, in running against Nancy Pelosi as a socialist in San Francisco, the most concerted, unapologetic, and I dare say dangerous examples of white supremacy that I have ever encountered. And I've lived, just to make this explicit, in St. Louis, Missouri, in Chicago, in San Francisco for over a decade each. I've lived in Washington, D.C. I've spent time living for weeks at a time, everywhere from Houston to Salt Lake City. Not a single one of those cities, in any of them, have I encountered anything like what I have here in San Francisco. And I
give us some specific examples. What specifically have you experienced there?
Particularly journalists suppressing whistleblowers, exposing racist election disinformation fabricated by Democratic Party operatives specifically to insulate Pelosi by misleading voters and ultimately undermining the integrity of a federal election. The thing I would note here, just to tie these two parts of the conversation together, Nancy Pelosi has served in Washington in Congress since 1987, and not once in the last 34 years has she ever debated an opponent. A week after the San Francisco Chronicle published a front page story above the fold noting that Pelosi is ignoring calls for a debate, I faced the first of a series of escalating, expanding smears, all fabricated, all ultimately debunked. The city's last black newspaper, the San Francisco Bayview, published an article describing it as a civic lynching that was orchestrated by Democrats to insulate the party leader. And that is an example of not just white supremacy, but to draw a tighter circle around it. I faced anti-Muslim bigotry here in San Francisco, orchestrated by Democrats, far worse than what Democrats have seen fit to criticize from Lauren Boebert. The comments from Boebert to Ilhan were an offensive joke, and I am also offended by it. I am frankly more offended by serious accusations orchestrated by Democrats to mislead voters and undermine election integrity.
And you believe that smear campaign directly involved Speaker Pelosi, a smear campaign, a disinformation of voters, all of that directly tied to her?
Not directly. The way I've described this is that the incentives were created at the top. This is specifically the DCCC blacklist, which Pelosi put in place in the last cycle to basically make staff and consultants who worked for candidates like me, challenging entrenched incumbents, they were ineligible for further work with the party, having worked for someone like me. So the DCCC blacklist that Pelosi put in place created a systematic incentive for anyone who had worked for me and then did no longer, like the people who smeared me, to orchestrate these kinds of attacks. Now, it wasn't just an incentive from the top. The orchestration of these lies, which have been debunked and exposed to the public, investigative journalists at both The Intercept and Salon and the SF Bayview have revealed the orchestration of this plot. The suppression of an Afro-Latino whistleblower who is an elected Democratic Party official. She was threatened by white Democratic Party operatives who continue to work in City Hall to this day. There were elected public officials who were backing these lies to score political points by smearing an immigrant, brown-skinned Muslim, for political purposes. And the part I'd want to say here is that the political purposes of an orchestrated smear campaign render it no less racist. If anything, if we understand racism as intersecting with capitalism and militarism, as Dr. King educated us, political motivations don't make a set of attacks less racist. They actually render it more racist, because the point of racism is not just to promote racial hierarchy, but ultimately to entrench and insulate power. And that's exactly what the purposes of these fabrications and orchestrations were. And to put this another way, to smear the immigrant Muslim required also suppressing and threatening women of color who these Democratic Party operatives were disingenuously claiming to stand for. And
to insulate power, insulating power is not new in politics, right? It happens in both parties where an established representative decides, okay, I'm gonna wall off any challenge. But what you're saying, it sounds like, is that this wasn't just a matter of Nancy Pelosi trying to protect her turf or trying to put down a challenge, but that she and her operatives engaged in Islamophobia to do so.
Absolutely, that her operatives, facilitated by the press, and this also connects to two parts of our conversation. This is a crisis not only for the Democratic Party, but it frankly reveals a profound problem with respect to press ethics and journalists being willing to give whistleblowers opportunities to correct the public record. It is particularly interesting to me that none of the white journalists who amplified the various accusations that were all ultimately found to be false, not a single one of them have updated or corrected their stories a full year later.
Do you think that's personal or institutional on their part?
Institutional, absolutely. I mean, I could be anyone and they would fabricate smears towards me. This is not about the individuals at play. This is absolutely about the institutional interests that are being insulated by this demagoguery. And one reason I'm very adamant about calling it out is that Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry are being discussed in the country today widely as if they are partisan phenomena. But the fact of the matter is, they are sadly bipartisan. Democrats are up to their necks in the very same things that they are thankfully calling out the GOP for. And again, if anything, the GOP's most prolific examples of it recently were decidedly more innocuous than the way that the Democratic Party has actively leveraged anti-Muslim bigotry in the service of its leaders' interests.
Shahid, if Speaker Pelosi were to grant a debate and you had her on stage or in some sort of format and you had an opportunity for 30 or 40 seconds to make a statement to her, what would it be?
We face profound risks in our civilization. They include a pandemic, they include a mounting global climate crisis. And I'm eager to see San Francisco represented by a voice in Washington that will prioritize dealing with those crises instead of hurling every last cent at a military industrial complex that is frankly part of the problem, particularly when we think about the connections between militarism and climate crisis. They're in no way subtle. And between the Pentagon being the largest institutional source of carbon pollution and our military industrial complex repeatedly waging wars for particularly fossil fuel plunder, militarism as the record of this incumbent, the primary legacy of Nancy Pelosi is the bipartisan commitment to militarism, and San Francisco deserves better.
Shahid Buttar, he is the progressive challenger to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi in the Democratic primary for the 2022 election. And Shahid, good luck to you, and I appreciate you coming on. I do hope, I think it'd be enlightening to everybody if in fact she did grant you some sort of debate and you had an honest discussion, the two of you, about the issues instead of some of this other nonsense. But in any case, good luck to you, Shahid, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me, David.
You got it.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks, really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.